Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Equipping Your People to Handle Challenging Times, and we are in challenging times. I am Anna, and I am with ThinkHuman and calling from my home in San Francisco. I sincerely hope you and your families and colleagues are all well and healthy. Thank you for joining us today, while as humans, we are facing a global challenge together. We're going to get started in just a few minutes, and we'll be talking about how you can support your managers at this time with the recent changes due to COVID-19. So as you get started, we'd love to get the conversation started. And one of the ways that we'll be interacting is by using the chat feature in the Zoom, and throughout the next hour, we'll be asking you to go back to the chat to have a conversation with us. And if you're looking for it, in case you haven't been using Zoom over the past month or so, just hover over your Zoom window and you'll find it in the lower right. So we intend for this conversation to get really rich and more helpful. And it's really helpful if you all get involved. So we encourage you to join the conversation and chat away in the chat box. So for starters, we'd like to know more about you. So please, in the chat room, tell us what your name is and where you're dialing from. Brussels, Austin, Texas, Tampa, Florida, British Columbia, Wisconsin. It's amazing. Oh my goodness, it's going so fast, I can't even keep up. UK, Colorado, it's going too fast. Thank you. It's amazing. Thank you so much. So, why are we here today? We'd love to know that, actually. And so if you are willing, please answer the question in the chat box. What insight or feeling are you hoping to gain out of this conversation? Again, if you're willing to share that, go ahead. Again, the question is, what insight or feeling are you hoping to gain out of this conversation? Fluidity. Empowered and lifted, inspiration, helping my team to be resilient in the face of a ton of changes. Validated, how to support my team, employee engagement, coping strategies, resiliency, cohesion of staff while we are divided into separate teams, best practices, and on and on and on. The panelists will be reading your what you want to get out of it. So continue to put that into the chat box. Before we dive into our discussion, I want to quickly introduce our partners. CultureAmp. CultureAmp is the leading people and culture platform helping companies take action to improve employee engagement, retention, and performance. CloverLeaf. CloverLeaf's online platform helps individuals and teams understand themselves better so that everyone can do their best work. And ThinkHuman. ThinkHuman is a leadership development and manager training company supporting leaders at all levels by driving lasting behavioral change and habit formation within themselves and their teams. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to Meredith, the CEO of ThinkHuman, who will be leading our discussion. Welcome, Meredith.
Thank you so much, Anna, and welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you here in this conversation today. We saw in the chat people from all over the globe in this conversation about equipping your people to handle challenging times. And we have this incredible panel of experts, leaders from high performance organizations that are here to share their experience and be taking your questions about how to equip people in challenging times. So before we get started, a few small tech items. In the upper right-hand corner, you should see a button for gallery view. And that way you can see all the panelists at once versus just who is speaking. I'm sure most of you know this already, but just in case you don't, that's the Brady Bunch view. So you can click on that. And then at the bottom, as Anna said, the chat icon, so you can get into this conversation. This is not TV. We really want to hear your voice, your questions, and your comments. Before we dive in, which we're about to do, let me introduce these amazing panelists that we have here today that are going to be taking your questions. So we have Natasha Kehikmar, the Chief People Officer at Fandom. We have Scott Dust, the Chief Research Officer at CloverLeaf and an endowed professor of management at the Miami University. We have Ken Matos, the Director of People Science from CultureAmp, and James Rosseau, an executive facilitator from ThinkHuman, who has previously been an executive overseeing over 2,000 people, including through challenging times like 9/11 and Katrina. So we have this incredible group of panelists here. Please get involved in the conversation. Submit your questions using the chat. And let's start broadly with context. So this may seem obvious or overly obvious, but let's just clarify what we're talking about when we refer to the challenging times that people are facing. There's a lot of a talk right now about equipping people to do remote work, and we're not just talking about all of us suddenly working remotely. So what are we referring to when we're talking about equipping people leaders to lead in challenging times? What are some of the things that people and people leaders are dealing with? And Ken, let's start with you.
So that's such a great question, because I think right now there's like three big things going on. So there's the changes in work processes, like remote work, or how you're going to continue working in place. There's the isolation that comes from social distancing, which is a big emotional drain on people, as well as the just generalized fear that we're all feeling from COVID-19 and its potential effects on our businesses, our families, our friends, our coworkers. I think all three of those things are sort of operating simultaneously, and then they spin off a variety of like specific tactical pains. Like, what do we do to bring people back? How do we make sure they can still do their jobs? How are we going to acknowledge the loss of life and livelihoods that are happening right now? All of those are just, I think, the on the ground manifestations of those big ideas that are happening at the top.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. You know, and from a leadership perspective, I think one of the things we like as leaders is control. Right, and you're talking about lack of control at unprecedented levels, as well as not understanding when you'll get that control back, right? And so that absence of expectancy creates a lot of stress, as well as an absence of a definition of what the new normal will be, right? Just continues to pile onto those things, I think is a big part of what people are dealing with as well.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. I think the circumstances make it really challenging in that there's now a lot of embedded paradox in all of the day-to-day decisions that we have to face, where we're dealing with things that we have to balance short-term versus long-term interests, right? Do we need to cut deep now in order to survive in the future? People want information right away, but at the same time, the information has to be as accurate as possible. People want certainty and control, yet we don't know what we don't know. So we have to give the information that we do have. There's this constant push-pull balancing act that really is not about solving the paradox. It's about managing the paradox, which is hard.
I think there's one other element that we don't always talk about, and that is the who we are. So if we are living on our own and away from others, what might have been I'm alone may start to show up as I'm lonely. And how do you deal with that in this setting? If you've tried to work through balancing childcare or elder care with work, like even with that, there are distractions. Now it's ever present. And so it makes things, it sort of amplifies challenges in our lives that we've had, and we don't have the escape that we might have had before.
That's good.
So much. All right, so I just want to highlight some of the things that I heard. There's fear, loneliness, lack of control and certainty, limited information, loss, holding paradox, all at once as we try to get our work done and lead others through this time. So let's talk about the role of people leaders in this, and why are we talking about equipping the people leaders? So Natasha, maybe let's start with you.
I think the key for me when I think about people leaders is very much about recognizing that they have a pebble in the water impact on organizations, but we as people leaders are also going through all of these things. So we too struggle, and one of the things I've really had to think about is, am I allowing my team and myself the space to go through this too? And or am I so focused on the goals or the things that we need to achieve that I'm being very driven, which can be good, but to the exclusion of allowing people space to go through this shift for themselves. And so actually, I think that is a critical aspect, is making sure that we allow our managers to have the space and the opportunity to go through what they need to go through and know that there are going to be ups and downs. We need our people managers more than ever right now, but we can't, I don't think we can have the same expectations. Certainly we can't have the same expectations as we might have had before. And so just as our people, our employees' performance might go up and down in these moments, so too with our people managers. So I think the biggest thing we can do to equip them is to have them understand and know that we are giving them some space. There are lots of tools and techniques and tips, absolutely. But to me, that's a fundamental.
Yeah, I would totally echo what Natasha just said. And, one of the things I think about when we think about people leaders is we expect them to influence the outcomes of each and every situation, right? And so when we talk about equipping them, I try to, for my own sake, as I'm getting older, boil things down into oversimplistic acronyms. So I'll share one and then I'll unpack it as we kind of continue to talk. But I call this acronym SCORE. And it's really simple. The S stands for self-care. The very first thing I would advocate for is self-care. The C is for community care. The O is for objectives, and I'll talk to this later, but the real focus on the what and the why over the how, because the how has got to be in question for now. The R is really around reconciliation, and I'll again unpack some of this later, but really reconciling and how you think about what you stop, start, and continue during this time. And then the E is for execute, plan, do, and review. And that has to be different as well, the frequency of plan, do, and review, because the facts are changing, not daily, intraday at this juncture. And so in terms of equipping people, that's how I think about it, this SCORE model. And again, I'll unpack some of that as it makes sense during the conversation.
I like to think of it as sort of three buckets as well. So I think the things that employees really need their leaders to focus on to help them deal with things like childcare and competing pressures that this situation has created is guidance on three things. So the first is priorities. So what needs to be done, what can be delayed, what can be dropped so that they can manage all the spinning plates. The second is permissions. So what am I allowed to do on my own? What can I decide without fear of performance repercussions? I think a lot of times employees know exactly what they need, but they don't believe they have the right to do it. And then the third is professionalism, which is role modeling what's expected of me in this moment, where our instinct is to try to replicate pre-COVID situations, and it's just not possible. Like, the dogs will bark, the kids will come in, like finding a way to fold that into a very human form of professionalism rather than the old industrial / corporate buttoned up suit person who is perfectly able to separate all the pieces of their lives, which quite frankly only works if you have someone at home who can do all those things for you and allow you to hide them from everybody else. And nobody has that anymore.
Yeah. But Ken, I would just want to jump in on that real quick. That is so important, right? The exampleship component of the realness of it is so important. And a lot of us will remember that that news reporter, I can't remember a while ago, that went viral when the daughter popped in the room and was bouncing around in the background. A lot of it that was so funny to us was that we could relate to it, right? Because we know we've all had those situations, but it's so relatable. So to the extent that as leaders, we're okay with those authentic moments and not trying to be so buttoned up and exhibit exampleship through real life situations and such during this time, it's very key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ken.
I was just going to say that the beauty of now is that we're all experiencing it simultaneously, which makes it a much easier argument to make than before when it was, you just can't manage your stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well put. Another model that's been talked about a lot, and so trying to give leaders, managers, something concrete to carry forward in their conversations and in their decisions on how they're going to help their people. One popular model is the demand control support model. And so think of it as 3 different buckets for how you might help your people. You could try to do your best to reduce the demand, to use Ken's terminology, help them reprioritize. You can also give them more control. So you're not responsible for knowing everything. It's crisis. There's so much going on. You can't know everything. So have that conversation about, here's where I want you to go. Here's the boundaries of how you can potentially get there. Now it's up to you. So give some control and ownership. And then the last one's the support, whether it's emotion focused or problem focused, right? Solving a problem, giving them resources, etc. And I'm really curious to hear within Ken, Natasha, James, within your organizations or for your clients, what kind of things are you guys doing now? I know CloverLeaf has some, but what type of things are you guys doing to work on that support component? That, because I think relatedness, I'm seeing it pop up in the chats consistently. People feel isolated. People feel like they don't have this community anymore. Relatedness is one of our underlying psychological needs next to self-determination and security, right? And all of a sudden it's been stripped away, but we can't, there's some things we can do to try and facilitate that and organize that. So I'm really curious to hear what you guys think.
One thing that pops to my mind is helping people change their expectations of what relatedness means in this situation. I feel like a lot of people go, oh, it's just going to be a virtual meeting. It's going to suck. And so they don't invest in making it as good as it could be because it's not as good as they would like it to be. And so I think some of it is helping people reset some of their expectations and then investing in making those things good. So doing the virtual happy hours, doing the connection between people at work, and also encouraging employees to connect with people outside of work. One of my colleagues wrote a really cool LinkedIn post about how exhausted she was from doing all the work connected things, and it wasn't leaving her time for the family and friends connected things. I was like, am I allowed, this is a great example of permissions. She's like, am I allowed to not attend all of them? I'm like, yeah, they're for you. Like, if they're not giving you energy, go do something else. And so I think that's been a really important piece for people.
Mm-hmm.
I really hear what comes to mind as you all are talking is Maslow's hierarchy and how much relatedness, connection, belonging is a fundamental human need, whether that's through our work community, through other communities, but taking care of those fundamental needs and bringing it back to, as Natasha said, the people leaders who are the ripple in the pond, helping those people leaders provide that for themselves and for all the people that they are leading. Clearly that ripple in the pond has a huge effect. You all have already spoken about having people leaders fill their own cup first. I think, James, you called it self-care as your S in SCORE. You want to talk for a minute, any of you, about how you get people leaders to do that? Because it's one thing to send an email or a Slack saying, please take care of yourself, fill your cup. But what are the ways to actually embed that? And Natasha, let's start with you.
So one of the things that we've been doing at our executive team with amazing CEO is he does a check-in with everybody. So we actually spend a good chunk of our executive team meetings each week. How are you doing? What's going on for you right now? And we're dispersed to begin with, and it's allowed us an opportunity to get to know each other. And we don't have that influence of a lot of people being in one room and then 2 or 3 people being remote. So it's being on Zoom, all of us, it's the great equalizer. So it has, I think, brought us closer together. We've gotten to know each other a little bit better because we share the highs and the lows of what's happened over the past week or over the weekend. So that's been one thing that we've done. I just did something last week with my team, and I asked them, in our one-on-ones, and I did let everybody know we're going to be doing this as a group, but in the one-on-ones, when are you going to take a PTO day? What does PTO look like right now? It's very different. But you know, it's you're sort of in that space where you're at home and there's a closet next to you that you've been meaning to clean out for, you know, I don't know, maybe years, and you're not getting to it, even though it's right next to you. And sometimes those things, they start to nag at you. But what does working from home be like? How do you actually switch off? When you're in different time zones from the rest of your colleagues, where do you allow yourself time for yourself? So those are the conversations I've been having more recently with folks, mainly because I've recognized in myself that I need that. And I'm like, well, gee, what else is missing? And so now I'm asking, more actively asking. And I think this is where self-awareness as a manager makes a huge difference. And I didn't necessarily realize the gap in the beginning, because we're now in week 6 of working from home in our company. In the first couple of weeks for my team in particular, we're just jamming to get information out, to get steps in place for people. We were on all the time and trying to get the regular goals done, right? So the other thing I would say is, you know, and I think, Ken, you mentioned this about what are the priorities right now? I think we do need to examine the cadence of regular meetings that we've been having. So we normally have this meeting on a monthly basis, and it's a report out on A, B, and C, and we do it every month. Does that work for this environment? I'm not saying scrap it entirely, but I think it merits review and discussion. And that's another thing that I think we can do to allow ourselves the opportunity to sort of reflect a little bit and not just go in autopilot. There is a need for us to have some normalcy, some sense of consistency, but I think it needs to be balanced with, let's just do a check-in. Does this still make sense for us right now? How is it working or not working?
That's good. I think, you know, a couple things. One, it's you know, starting with the CEO and everyone in leadership, it's giving people permission for self-care, right? Because again, leaders jump into action believing that they need to influence outcomes, and giving people permission. And then 2, exampleship, right? So to your point of how do you communicate this, there's the message and the medium. A part of the message is hopefully expressing yourself. What are you doing around self-care, right? So to the extent that you're sharing with folks, you know what, I've incorporated a 15-minute walk, even if it's in my big backyard, or I've added my workout. I can't go to the gym, but here's what I'm doing. I'm not answering emails in the morning. I'm not starting my day that way. I start fresh with meditation or whatever I do. These are the things I do to kind of get myself on balance so I can bring myself to you guys in a better way, right? This is how I put my mask on first, right? We've all heard it on our flights, right? The reason to put our mask on first is to so we have a supply of oxygen, so then we can really be in service to all those around us. I think that's a big part of the message to give to leaders.
Yeah, I see a lot of virtual clapping happening in the chat about that it's one thing to cascade a message that people put self-care as a priority, and altogether another for the senior most leaders to model it, to share vulnerably what they are doing, to take time off, to talk about how they're taking care of themselves, so that leaders at all levels are not just seeing that message in a written communication, but actually seeing it modeled for them. So great.
One thing I'd love to add to that I think it's really important for leaders to do is recognize they have more resources than their staff and their teammates. And so I think the one thing I really like to emphasize for leaders is whatever you do, don't create time for yourself by delegating to someone else. Actually stop something. Because for the rest of your team, they don't get someone else to give it to. Something has to be put down for them to pick up self-care. So if you want to be a role model in this, tell them what you're putting down and that no one else is going to pick up so that you can do self-care. Because I think otherwise it's like, well, that's great for you, but I don't have somebody to give it to. So I guess I'm doing everything and self-care.
Yes. I heard earlier Ken, you say, I think you said done, delayed, and dropped. Maybe it was different than that, but I heard you in terms of guidance on priorities for managers, both for themselves and also how they are working with their people. And James, I think I heard you say at the beginning something about stop, start, continue. So let's just talk for a moment about equipping people leaders to re-examine priorities. And any of you can jump in on this, but what's the approach that you recommend, and how do organizations equip people leaders to do this effectively?
Sure. And before we jump there, can I just answer one thing from somebody in the chat? Upsana made a point around this self-care and beyond permission, employers giving people space to do that, right? And this is a big part of the leadership opportunity in this moment. When you're having one-on-ones, and I think Natasha said some of this, and you're talking to people about what works and what doesn't work during this time, you're also looking for the spoken and the non-spoken about their needs, right? And that's a huge part of this emotional intelligence moment that we're in as well. You know, one of the things we're hearing from ThinkHuman clients, for example, is, you know, how do we become better at working remotely and all these things? And this is so beyond working remotely. This is about, again, unprecedented time in history in terms of dealing with a pandemic and a novel crisis, right? And so one of the things we're trying to reorient our clients to think about is what's being called for right now is a heightened level of operating as a people leader, right? Heightened levels of emotional intelligence. So self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, so on and so forth. This is different. So as an example, as a leader, one of the things you can be polling for is what are their needs? So if your staff meetings used to be at 10 a.m. and you're hearing from people directly or indirectly that really what will work better is 6 p.m., you have a critical choice to make whether or not you can move it to 6 p.m. And there are no rules except the rules that you help are a proponent for, and that you want to help change during this time. And that's what I mean by the how. The what is the company's mission and vision and so on, what you have to complete for your clients, but the how in this moment is up for debate and up for you to kind of drive a new course forward. So sorry for interrupting your question, but I want to
No, it's great, James. That's fantastic. I think that the point of helping people leaders come off autopilot and have increased self-awareness and social awareness to see A, how their blind spots are impacting them, and B, what do their people need, including, just to bring it back to the last question, helping people leaders readjust what to focus on, what to stop, what to start, what to continue. And actually, Natasha, we haven't heard from you in a moment. You want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think, you know, we've talked a lot about self-care. We've talked a lot about permission. I want to just share a little bit about initiative that I'm seeing some of our managers take. So we decided to do what a lot of other companies have done and start a little trivia thing. And so we're using water cooler trivia. I'm not getting paid to endorse them, but it was just started. So we started a Slack channel for water cooler trivia, and now we've had leaders and managers and individual contributors from all over the place posting questions every day and multiple times during the day because they're having fun with it. And they didn't ask permission. They didn't need to ask permission. It's part of our culture to really get into DDB, so Dungeons and Dragons, into different fan communities. So this is part of our thing. It's part of our shtick. And so it's wonderful to see people embrace it and just go for it. We had somebody ping me and say, hey, I want to create a remote work channel. I work remotely all the time, and I want to share some tips and tricks with people and just share some of the things that I do and create a space for that. And he pinged me to ask permission. I'm like, yeah, whatever, go for it. We in our roles can't aim to control how people show up in this moment, right? Because that's about imposing what I want on others. And just as a great coach will focus on, and I don't mean an athletic coach, I mean other kinds of coaches, a great coach will focus on having the client lead and have the person they're working with lead the conversation. Similarly, we in senior leadership roles need to give people the space, and I know this has been mentioned before, but to come into their own in this time.
Yeah.
And that's been happening very much so with our employees. And I'm really proud of that. And I don't take any credit for it. I'm not responsible for it. They're doing it. What's on me is to not constrain it.
Yeah, to create the space and enable the autonomy for people to lean in.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on to another question. And Scott, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I just had a related point that I think ties into something
please.
James and Natasha said. So James was talking about earlier, this need for leaders to be a little bit more in tune in terms of social awareness, emotional intelligence. One of the challenges is that a lot of that awareness happens in face-to-face interaction, right? The majority of communication happens through body language, and you're not there in person. So all you're doing is reading text. So it becomes even harder to really understand the individualized needs of every person with your environment, which I think is what Natasha's speaking to a little bit, is starting some of those more organic conversations. And so relatedly, CloverLeaf's hearing the same types of things from their clients. And so they actually recently created an app that is creating those types of conversations through Slack as well, right? There's people that are on there, if you download the free app, but then it allows you to be able to have more substantial team-oriented conversations. What's really going on inside your head right now? What are your biggest concerns? What are some of the things that you're not necessarily saying within a line of text through an email or through a management meeting? It's creating that space to say it's okay to talk about these types of things. That is the support. That is the self-care that has to happen in some type of forum.
Yeah, Ken and James, I've heard both of you speak about this level of, I think James, you called it community support, and Ken, I've heard you talk about attuning to the pain that people are in. So either of you want to jump in about this?
Sure. Can you want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
You go first.
Okay, sure. Well, I think about four things. One, compassion, right? Literally asking people how they're managing their own self-care. And again, like I said, starting that with some exampleship and talking about how you're doing it, and then asking them, and hopefully not real quick too, right? So it's not like, 1 second, how you doing? Tell me what's going on, and then moving right to their task list. But seriously, intentionally ask them how they're doing. Two, trying to make a connection, right? So make no assumptions about how they're doing in this moment. Really trying to make a connection. And to Scott's point, you're not face to face, but just think about it like some of us who are a little older, well, I'm dating myself, in the Disney world of MBWA, management by walking around, trying to practice that virtually, right, by Zoom calls and things like that. So still trying to get that same connection. Three, creating a space for open dialogue, right, for your team. So you may, as you're querying your team, find, I used to have a team, for example, that wanted to be together all day. And even if they sat in the same room and they may not have talked much, they just felt better being in the same room of about, I don't know what it was, 150 square feet. So be it. If that made them happy, that makes them happy. If your team decides, for example, they want a Zoom room that's open all day so they can just see each other, and they may not be in a meeting per se, but they are happier literally seeing each other while they all work and happen to see each other's faces, facilitate it and tell them it's okay to do. That's a part of the query process. And then lastly, being flexible. And that's what I talked about in terms of the staff meeting shift. If you're finding that because of childcare at home and all the things that people are dealing with, be flexible. My class from Kellogg, we are finding that we're doing things with each other that I would have never expected. We now have a Friday 5 o'clock happy hour we do with each other that just started. And now we're celebrating birthdays together via Zoom, right? That we get on a Zoom call and we just celebrate birthdays. It turned into a 2-hour thing. So, I think everyone is finding new ways of still being humanly connected and whatnot during these times.
Ken, let's hear from you.
I would add, really take a moment to connect with yourself, because I think part of what throws off the process for leaders is our own anxieties and fears about what we have to get done. What are people going to say to us? How will I look later? Trying to be, the pillar of support and like everything is fine. I've got this under control. And in reality, we're also terrified out of our minds. And that will either manifest through bad behaviors, like we will snap at people, we'll be short, we'll emotionally distance because we don't feel like we can connect, but neither can we show pain. Or we will go into that deeper emotional distance place where it's like, great, this meeting starts at this time. We talked about the work things, the meeting ends. And I was just on a different webinar where they did some stats around the efficiency of their meetings. And they found that work from home made them much more efficient. They started and stopped on time, but everyone was lonely because the things that made their meetings delay was all of the gel and interconnectedness that made those meetings run well and help them anticipate other people's needs. And so I think if we want to build emotional connection between and with our teams, we first have to really sort of look inside at our own anxieties that distract us from being able to do that in a really constructive way.
Natasha, anything you want to add about community care, compassion, connection, and how to embed that happening with the people leaders?
Absolutely. And actually, Julia posted a question in the chat about how are we equipping people. So I want to share something that I haven't actually shared internally at my company yet. We've talked about it on our team, but we are thinking about introducing what we're calling manager circles. So I have 5 of us on the people and talent side. And we are going to, at the leadership team level, we are each going to facilitate a group or 2 of managers. And it's opt-in, it's not required. But the idea here is that we can introduce peer coaching. These will be facilitated conversations, but not just slides that we look at. Rather, here's a topic. Let's talk about one-on-ones in this context. And so we in the people and talent function can provide a couple of tools and techniques, but encourage and build a peer coaching environment so that these manager circles, we can learn from each other and we can learn from people who bring a certain level of expertise. We thought of this as opposed to doing a seminar or telling people to go watch something, watch a webinar or go online or read an article as the sole approach, because we're going through this too. And we wanted to also make sure that we tap into people who have always led remote teams or who are really good at it, have done it a long time, or for those who've never done it before and are really lost, to feel safe, that they can ask questions and not feel weak or not so smart. And so we're trying this, we're going to try this. It may not work, but we're going to try it because we haven't had a strong track record of people leader development at our company. There have been efforts, to be fair, but we haven't had a strong embedded approach to it. And so we're going to try this in this time where everyone's very open to trying new things, because what else can we do? But maybe this manager circle approach will allow us to have a little bit of facilitated learning, a little bit of self-directed learning, and a little bit of shared learning, shared coaching, peer coaching to one another, that could provide people with maybe not one-on-one guidance, but small group discussion where you can experiment and come back together next time. And in the next conversation, I would say, James, you know, we talked about showing gratitude and we talked about one specific technique. Did you try it? And James says, I didn't try it. It's not my shtick. I'm uncomfortable with that. It's not really my thing. And Scott says, you know, it was uncomfortable for me too, but I tried it and the person was so happy. So James, try it, right? So I, as facilitator, am introducing an idea, but Scott as peer is providing the coaching and the encouragement to a peer. So we're going to try that. There's a ton of material out there that we can look at. There are materials on resilience. There are materials on running remote meetings. All of these things exist. In fact, there are even almost public curricula on how to develop a people manager, right? I still have that thing from PDI Ninth House on how to be a successful manager. It's this big fat book, it's that thick. All these different things you can do. We could run manager circles based on the table of contents from that book. So we don't have to get super fancy and elegant. And for me, this is absolutely not about PowerPoint slides. And we can have somebody in there taking notes and send the notes out to the group afterwards. It can be that simple. But I don't think it's fair for us to ask managers to operate differently without helping them figure out how, or helping on the path. And so this is our small attempt to do that.
Yeah, it's really powerful. I
Love
just
that.
want to, James, were you going to say something
It
else?
works.
No, I just said love that. Yeah. Love
Yeah.
it.
What I really appreciate, Natasha, is there are so many different ways to support managers, whether it's with a one-on-one guide, or I think you had talked about in the past, like Mad Libs of questions that they can be asking,
Yes.
or these, I'll turn it back to you to talk about that, or these manager circles, but finding keep deepening the reservoir of how the managers are getting equipped to fill their cup and then take care of their people. Did you want to just mention what that Mad Libs was?
Oh yeah. So
Yeah.
my loony idea was when we're having a conversation with someone, maybe a way to make it easier for managers to think about how to introduce a topic, or how to have a conversation that might be a compliment or something that's more challenging, is to create sort of a Mad Libs approach. So I don't know if y'all remember Mad Libs from when you were kids, or if you used Mad Libs when you were kids, but it was this thing that was printed on newsprint, and it would be a story, and it would ask for an adjective and a noun. And so you would ask your partner for an adjective, a noun, a number, and then you'd read the story all together after you filled in the blanks, and it would be very silly if done right, very goofy. But why not use that approach for managers having conversations with their people? We all, like, they know what they need to say, they don't know how to say it. If we prepared a little bit of a script so that it was fill in the blanks. So fill in the adjective, fill in the objectives.
Yes.
Why not do that for people? We all have to have the same kinds of conversation all the time as managers. So
love it, Natasha. I don't know if you have the Mad Libs available to share afterwards, but if you don't, okay. James, did I cut you off? I just want to make sure if you were going to say no. Okay, well then I have a question that came up that I want to send to you, Scott, which is about growth or fixed mindset relative to managing in chaos. And so how can we be thinking about growth mindset versus fixed mindset as we're leading through crisis, and how does personal growth play in?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So this is really getting into what would be called cognitive reappraisal. So anything that comes into your purview, you have the opportunity to view it as a threat or as an opportunity. And the literature on growth mindset would essentially say, this challenge that you're facing, whether it's being forced to learn how to remote work, or learning how to manage those that you don't see face to face on a regular basis, or deal with just change in general, all of that could be seen as an opportunity to learn and grow and develop. And one way to think of it is, interestingly, over time, organizations are becoming less and less concerned about task proficiency and more concerned about adaptive performance, where we're also starting to see it's super important that regardless of the circumstances, change or not, you have to be able to adjust and excel, given that things are going to be more volatile, uncertain, complex than anything else. So, I mean, over the last 3 decades, we've already started to kind of move closer to adaptive performance and farther away from task proficiency. But now this experience is really kind of putting it into overdrive. And so you could cognitive reappraise this opportunity as, this is something we can learn from, something we can do about it. Whether you're the individual or you're the manager or leader trying to help your followers, your subordinates, et cetera, think through what's a good way to learn and develop from all of this.
Yeah, Scott, I can really relate personally to what you're saying, from both personal challenges that I've been through, like great personal loss, where finding not how to just survive or endure it, but how to grow from it has been like the defining factor of carrying me through in a way where I didn't just get smaller from surviving the experience, but got bigger from searching for how can I grow? And what I hear in what you're saying, Scott, is how do we do that as people leaders to support that for the people that we're leading, not just ourselves? Ken or James, anything you want to add about that or growth mindset at this time? Ken? No?
No,
Okay. All
No,
right.
good there.
Well, then how about, again, there doesn't have to be anything on this, but I've seen in the Q&A, separate from the chat, questions about personal growth, which just on the heels of growth mindset, before we move away from it, thoughts on personal growth and how we put that front and center for people leaders and for people leaders with their people. Any thoughts from any of you? Natasha? Yeah.
Yeah. You know, this is one I've been thinking about because we launched a self-directed learning tool. We launched Udemy earlier this year in response to our CultureAmp survey results, where we acknowledge that learning and development is something that we need to invest in more consistently. Well, one of the things that's great about the tool is that people get super excited at launch. They're really, really happy. They're like, gosh, we know this isn't cheap and we know the company is investing in us. But it requires relaunch. And I think it requires relaunch at least every quarter, at least. You may offer consistent programming during the course of the year, but it requires relaunch. So, and I'm at that point right now where we have to do our relaunch. And I've been thinking about this very much because how do I do that now? We were planning to do deal hours like Udemy offers internally, drop everything and learn, an hour focused on just your own self-directed learning. How do you do that now? What do we do there? Do we maybe instead offer Ken to come in and do a fireside chat conversation as a way to encourage self-directed learning? And that was sort of a public request there, Ken.
Oh yeah, totally.
So how can he say no? But it's those things where now I'm in a space where I may not be switching off regularly, right? I am mentally tired. I'm exhausted. I'm working from home, so my boss may have requests or expectations that I'm going to be even more responsive because I don't have the commute to deal with anymore. And so when is that space and that closet is calling to me? And not to mention, I'm worried about parents who are not in this country that that are elderly, and there's no one from our immediate family there to take care of them. I have kids in the house. My husband can't take them all on his own. So all of those questions come into play. When is that time? And so one of the things I've been thinking about is we've been really good about introducing virtual happy hours and things like that. What if we offer, at that same time we offer virtual happy hour, learning time? So that individual learning time, so that for those who don't want to participate, they can either just continue doing their work or just take a moment, or they use that time for their own learning and their own growth. And that what they're learning is shared with their manager. They tell their manager, hey, I'm going to take a course on this. And then the manager asks them about that afterwards. Those are all things that I've been thinking about because, you know, the trivia, the virtual happy hours, it's not for everybody. Not everybody enjoys it. And we don't want it to be a forced fun experience like Ken was speaking about earlier, or mentioned that a colleague was talking about earlier. So I've been thinking about how do we actively make the space for that? So that's just one idea.
Yeah, I want to, sorry, I want to dovetail on some of the things Natasha said. So one, and I'm going to bundle a couple things together. So apologies if this is a little longer, but people leaders know, right? And when they're able to really stop and think about it, it's so hard to think clearly in times like this. We know people are always going to be our most important asset for our company, right? And so in times like this, the learning and development can get thrown to the wayside, right? It's like throwing stuff off the boat, right? So we think it'll help us float better, right? And if you really were able to stop and think about it, you know, it's not necessarily the best choice. And this kind of goes back to that stop, start, continue list and the R in my score. And the whole point of that stop, start, continue is to really slow down and do a thoughtful listing, right? So, you know, when stop, start, continue is simply, you know, whether you want to call it a taxonomy or just keep a crib sheet next to your desk, really taking the time to go through and think about the tasks that you're doing on a daily basis and ask your team to do the same thing and go, write those things down. Hour by hour, as you change things that you do, so on and so forth. What are the things that you absolutely know you should stop? And by the way, there will be things that you know you should have stopped weeks ago, months ago, years ago, but for whatever reason, you never did, right? Either it wasn't allowed for some reason, so on and so forth. But also in these times, do they make sense right now? What are the things that you should start doing because they'll either make you more efficient, more effective, etc. And then what are the things you absolutely should continue doing because they're on mission, they matter the most to your customers, etc. And I will almost guarantee you, you will create some sort of efficiency gains because the stop list will have some things on them and you will create some efficiencies. And with those efficiencies, invest in your most important assets, your people, to help them determine the right things. And this goes right back to some of the things we're hearing from the ThinkHuman clients around, again, how do we work better remotely during this time? This is not about working remotely. This is about a heightened level of unprecedented challenges, right? And how do you create more growth mindset, right? How do we help people think about growing and not contracting during this time, right? And bringing that emotional intelligence to bear, being more self-aware, going, process your feelings, understand all this, but also try to have that growth mindset shift of, I really want to grow during this time. So I want to embrace some learning opportunities and come out of this stronger than I was before. Not just be right, not just be right in everything, but come out stronger than I was before.
So good. I want to just highlight a few of the things that I'm hearing to bring it together. So, few big pictures. We're in this time of loss of control, certainty, limited information, fear, loneliness, daily rapid change, and people leaders who are so critical because they're touching all the front lines. They're those pebbles in the water. Having those people leaders have firstly permission and support to fill their own cup first, and that to recognize that this is not just a push into overdrive and survive, but the expectations are not the same. This is not business as usual. And there are new expectations, and those new expectations begin with self-care that's modeled from the top and filling one's own cup first, elevating our own self-awareness. So we're not just on autopilot, but seeing our experience and how we're showing up, and elevating our ability to notice and shift and see the same with our people. Putting in place, again, as part of the new normal, because it's not normal, that this isn't business as usual and priorities are not business as usual. How much you can get done and what things you're focused on needs to be changing right now. And it's the role of managers to reconfigure that and to really get people clear. What are they focused on and what are they saying no to right now? And potentially what new things are they making space for? And then I also heard this piece of learning and using this as a time to not just survive or bear through, but really find what are the places that people are hungry to be learning that's going to be expansive and useful in this moment. So as we consolidate all of that, I want to now turn our attention to this question of layoffs. It's come up a few times in the chat and I don't want to ignore it. So I'm going to start, Ken, with you. As companies and people leaders are going through navigating layoffs, not all, but many companies and people leaders, thoughts on how to equip people leaders to lead through that kind of loss and change?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple of things. I think first and foremost, leaders have to forgive themselves for having to make hard choices. I think, as I said earlier, a lot of bad behavior comes from not acknowledging your own sadness at what has to happen. Second, I think the thing organizations need to do is sort of think about two, broadly speaking, buckets of people. One are the ones who are going to leave, and how do we cushion that blow? Both, how do we have a communication method that allows them to respond back, to ask questions, to interact with us as we close down that relationship, rather than have it be like a text breakup. We also, and that can be things as like, here's just doing some of the little work of like, here's all the resources you can tap as you leave, I think is one really powerful thing you can do there. The other group is how do we keep the people who are still staying engaged? And I think that really speaks to the organizational justice stuff that CultureAmp talks a lot about, which is making sure there's a clear process for how those decisions were made that they can understand, because that allows them to have a better sense of, am I next in line? Or no, I really am a key part of how we find our way to the future unless something changes. And so I think the more we can have people understand how we're making decisions, the more engaged they're going to be, because they're not questioning whether or not the effort is futile.
Thank you so much, Ken. There's so much good stuff in there. Anything anybody wants to add? I know all of you have had rich experience. Natasha, it looks like you have something you want to say.
Yeah, so it's not something I wish on someone, but I would say that the most powerful experience a people leader can have is to lose your job. And the reason is you will never treat people the same way ever again when you have to do a termination yourself. But one of the realities that happens in times like these, or when a company is facing difficulty, is that the organization will make the layoff decisions at a higher level. And the manager whose employee is impacted may not even have been aware until 36 to 24 hours before. It's not great that this happens. I don't want to say that I'm endorsing this in any way, but it is a reality of how these actions take place. In my role, I can advise against it. However, again, then you run into the more people who know about it, the more likelihood of something getting out that shouldn't get out, or the wrong messaging is getting out. And so I actually want to dial it back a little bit and talk about that manager who doesn't have the opportunity to weigh in on the layoff decisions, and then is asked to implement those decisions. So to take action and be the one in the conversation with the employee when they're angry and grieving and wondering, wasn't I important enough to include in the conversation? All of those feelings are perfectly normal and perfectly understandable, and they may not go away, and that anger may not go away. And I think we have to think about that as we plan layoffs. And many companies now are moving very quickly to do layoffs. And so all of this is happening right now. Yes. And so, yes, absolutely. It sort of, for me, maybe for me, it goes without saying, but I should say it. We have to think about the conversation and how that conversation happens. And remember, managers, the conversation is not about you. So even though you are angry and heartbroken and are very sad, the conversation is not about you. So it's not about you. I understand how you feel. No, you don't. You understand how you feel. And you want to be there for the person you're talking with about what they're going through, but recognize you're not in their shoes. And it's very kind of you to think about yourself being in their shoes. That is, it is very generous and kind of you to do that, but you're not there. So you can only relate so much. And so you in some ways may have to compartmentalize. But if this experience of having a termination conversation or a layoff, multiple layoffs that you have to do, doesn't give you heartburn and make you unhappy, then you shouldn't be the one having the conversation either. That's the other side.
Yes.
So, much as that anger and sadness and discomfort is uncomfortable, it's really important.
Yes, Natasha, thank you so much for closing like that. In the interest of time, to be respectful of everybody, I am sad to bring us to a close given the really rich discussion. Thank you so much to this incredible group of panelists and your wisdom and heart and soul in this conversation, and to this incredible community for your questions and insights and shared advice. So grateful to all of you. Thank you for spending this hour with us. And in a moment, I want to turn this back over to Anna, who kicked us off. So Anna, you can come on back. And just as I turn it over to Anna, I just want to thank you all again. Please go make your version of this real in the world. And now, Anna, take us home.
Thank you all. This was an incredibly rich conversation, and I sincerely hope that you all got the insight and the feeling that you wanted to get out of this conversation. Our intention, I know this for a fact, is to support you in all the ways that you need most, especially at this time. So, to that end, in a moment, you are going to see a pop-up poll on the screen come up. I just got it, which means that you probably just got it as well. If you haven't, put something in the chat. If you want to hear more about a tech platform that uses psychometric assessments to help your people understand themselves better, please select CloverLeaf. If you want to hear about a survey platform to improve employee engagement, retention, and performance, please select CultureAmp. And if you want to hear more about training to equip your managers to do their best work and support their teams during this time, select ThinkHuman. By the way, you don't have to just select one. You can select as many as you want. You can do whatever you need to do for yourself. Again, thank you so much for being a part of this incredibly rich conversation. Together, we are discovering our way forward, and whatever hope, connection, or insight you received, please take that and make your own version of that real in the world. And goodbye, and have a wonderful day.